Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining yet another PASS BA virtual group presentation. Just at the outset, wanted to make sure we are going to cover the agenda for today's presentation. You can contact me on email or Twitter, and I dabble in business intelligence in a unified cloud approach to cloud provisioning platforms, as well as I'm undergoing a PhD program at one of the universities in India. We will go over the topics which are relevant to defining what exactly is a data application that we are working with. We would also like to go over the concepts with regard to high availability, high performance, and ensuring that the data application can be delivered at optimal levels of user access. There is also a discussion on how a report can be considered an application under certain circumstances. We will also be looking into the considerations with regard to using Power BI to develop those reports, and also to integrate those reports with the traditional web applications or Windows applications that you may have. And time permitting, we would like to look at some of the common data application development scenarios that can be solved using Power BI reports. When we get into application development, the first question arises as to what exactly is an application. Over a few form factors that have been introduced over the past few years, the definition seems to be changing based on whether a particular piece of software is run on a mobile device, whether it is run on a desktop, and whether it's provided as a web service or a web application. In general, though, any software that can perform a variety of functions can be termed an application. The shorter form app is usually restricted to the usage when it comes to form factors like mobile devices or tabs, and especially if the application only performs a single function. Now, the difference between an application and a data application is, of course, data. And we would like to present it as being organized and also persistent. When we mean organized, there is a structure around the data. It could be as simple as a relational table that can be created on Excel, SQL, or any of the database products. And when it comes to persistent, we are simply referring to the data being available either in memory or on the disk. It needs to be available for the application to access, and that is how data applications would be able to deliver the functions that they perform. In that respect, the recent trend has been that adding data to any application makes it a better choice. Now, when we look at one of the common mobile applications, especially in developing countries, it's simply the ability to have the mobile uh, deploy the flash as a torchlight. Now, would that need a data source? That's something that the application developers can decide, and then it is an area that we need to be very careful about. When it comes to traditional data application development, be it a web application or a Windows application, there's a lot of learning to be done. Whether it is a technology stack like LAMP, and which has been replaced by the mean stack, which is in terms of MongoDB, Express JavaScript, Angular, and Node.js. We're also seeing a resurgence in the universal Windows platforms and WPF applications coming up. Different languages like Ruby, Python, PHP, or scripting, even with PowerShell, seems to be catching up. And there's a lot of learning in that direction which is needed for anybody to be a professional application developer. Now, all this can take some time to learn. Perhaps we are looking at an investment of a couple weeks to a couple months, but that investment of time is still required in order to develop a viable data application as a minimum viable product. Now, did I mention that it can also be batch files? Okay. With a traditional data application development, it is not only the languages or frameworks that need to be learned. Um, Now, the backend is the important part of data applications. We need to learn concepts like server optimization in terms of whether we are going to consolidate the databases, whether we are going to cluster them or load balancers are in place. There's also the question of how the database product like SQL or Oracle or an enterprise, any enterprise database, it needs to be configured for the optimal performance as well as whether it can, deliver the throughput that we are looking for in terms of application performance. All these database products demand a certain amount of query development, especially in a popular language like SQL. And that would mean getting into query plans, indexes, learning when to use certain constructs and when not to. Uh, so I think being a part of the SQL user groups, you must have a good idea about what we are looking into if you want to learn that skill. From a front end standpoint, uh, earlier with on-premise models, there was a lot of web server optimization in place, which web developers had to work with the system admins and get in place, be it the use of web farms or the selection of the hosting provider where they wanted to deploy the website. In terms of connectivity to data, whether they were using connection pooling, whether there was caching for the data, all that had a bearing on the performance of the web application slash services. In recent times, we've also seen the emergence of reverse proxy and content delivery networks in order to deliver better performance for the applications that are being developed. If, let's say, a person in France is looking at a news application, um, would it be good to cache the static content in Paris rather than in New York? Those are the architecture and configuration questions that need to be answered uh, while setting up content delivery networks, and which mostly happen behind the scenes, but which could have some configuration elements to take care of. With AWS and Azure fighting it out, and I would say Google probably has some catching up to do. There's also the question of configuring settings on cloud resources and how they respond to web applications. There are also companies like Drutu, which are focused on a unified cloud provisioning model, which means you can go ahead and unify all the cloud resources across different providers in one place and set up the configuration over there. Whichever way we do it, we have to go ahead and uh, configure storage as well as compute and the web front options so that there is optimal performance for any application that we develop. This being the current or traditional data application development scenario, let's look at how Power BI brings a change in that respect. The first question arises, hey, we are talking about Power BI. Isn't that a data visualization slash reporting product? So would we consider a report to be an application? Now, we talked about an app being able to perform a particular task. We also talked about an application usually being able to perform a variety of tasks. With Power BI, we see that within a report, we can go ahead and have interactions between the various elements. Like you select an area of the map, you're able to see the change in the metrics with regard to maybe temperature or the rainfall or other values. We are also able to see uh, different pie charts or bar charts. We can make a selection, and the values related to the selection are filtered and shown on the report. What these do is they promote a meaningful interaction between different elements, which help users achieve a particular task. If I were going to, plan my Christmas vacation so that I could enjoy a white Christmas, I just have to look at the temperature and select the locations. If I selected Australia, I'm sure somebody would say, hey, mate, that's the wrong choice at this time of the year. Now, with Power BI, we have the option to review a few reports and find out whether those reports are able to promote such meaningful interaction and help the user achieve a particular task or objective. Only those reports could be considered as candidates for performing the work of an app or an application. So this is the part where what we are trying to project is there is a report, there is a data visualization, but it is not restricted to that. It is something that can help a user achieve a particular task in conjunction with perhaps other products and services that are integrated with Power BI. Let's take a look at some of the considerations for such reports. When it comes to replacing the traditional web development scenario, we talked about high performance and high availability. When we look at the architecture of Power BI, we see that it's hosted on Azure, and the configuration and architecture enable a high reliability or high availability from the administration standpoint, and you can be sure that your reports would be available pretty much 24/7 for most part of the year. When it comes to high performance, the architecture of Power BI allows for import of data, which changes the game from fetching data from disk to an in-memory construct, which enables high-speed rendering of the metrics which we are interested in. Power BI architecture is also built around a content delivery network, which automatically ensures that static elements of a report or dashboard are hosted and served from a geographic location nearest to the end user, which means that you have performance built in without having to go through the uh, process of learning those technologies and implementing them or configuring it with cloud providers which are available today. The other major benefit of selecting Power BI for developing some of the data applications rather than the traditional method is the time it takes to learn Power BI and start building your first report or dashboard. I'm sure that most of you, when you go ahead and access guided learning on the Power BI website, would be able to develop it within half a day and have the confidence that you can develop some really neat reports which can deliver tasks that your users are interested in. Of course, apart from the reports, there's also a complete set of samples for most of the concepts that Power BI introduces. There's also a sample release which is associated with every update of Power BI desktop. Those are some of the samples which can help you learn quickly and develop reports that would blow the minds of your end users to no extent. So with these powerful learning resources and also a growing global community, you can rest assured that developing apps on Power BI is going to be one of the easiest tasks that you would accomplish as part of your day. When it comes to using Power BI versus an application, the first question that arises is, how are these users accessing the reports and how are they going to get authenticated. The first part of that story, how the user would access the reports, they could either be using their mobile devices or their desktops or any other form factor, and access the reports over a URL. They could also access it within applications. They could also be consuming the reports as static elements which are exported and which are saved and shared over any communication channel. But the ideal scenario is we need to be focused on live reports which they are accessing over a URL, either through an application, app, or website. In those circumstances, uh, whether the user should be authenticated is one of the questions that we should decide on before going ahead with development on Power BI. If the user need not be authenticated at all, in that case, when we go ahead and develop a report, we have the option based on the data which is shown on the application or the report to share it publicly or publish it to the web. It is similar to developing a HTML page with data that you enter and hosting it on a website. Anybody across the world can access that website and see that HTML page. Um, when that is done, we need to be really careful about the data which is shown on that particular website. Is it data that you are allowed to share? Is it data that is aligned with copyright and data piracy related protections? So those are the aspects that one has to think about before going ahead with reports where the user need not be authenticated. The second scenario, where authentication happens via Active Directory, is a usual feature within Power BI. Most enterprises have an organization subscription to Power BI, and anybody logging on the Power BI service is authenticated via the Azure Active Directory. If it's a Power BI report server, they are authenticated via the Active Directory, and there's also the option to go ahead and customize authentication. The forms or other authentication option is therefore a question which is directed at the on-premise Power BI report server rather than the Power BI service, where such implementations are currently not available out of the box. It is something that has to be implemented when we are embedding Power BI reports onto an application. We'll come to that later. Uh, Once a user is authenticated, the next question is whether the user will share some input values to the application. If there are no inputs, for example, you want to just check out the weather in your hometown, or you want to check out the sports score of the local soccer team, then Power BI reports present an easy interface which we can provide to the user, optimized for both the end users as well as in terms of accessing an online web service or website and fetching that information to show the values. But in case the input from the user has to be collected and the input has to be saved, how do we deal with that? That's a scenario that Power BI is traditionally not built for. The Power BI option for user input in the simplest manner covers filters and user selections from a list of values that are already presented to them. If it's a new value which is being entered, it can be entered on the filters which are added. If there is a match, then that particular input can be taken. But still, if the user insists, no, I'm not going to make a selection, I'm going to give a new value that has to be part of the application, then the question arises, do I have the option to store that input and respond to it later, or do I have to respond to it right away? So the question is whether the output is needed right away, or whether the output can be generated after a while once the user gives the input data. Along with the consideration of whether the report should be dynamic and deliver the output right away. We also have to consider whether the report is going to process data where other services or programs are involved. If there is a lot of interaction between different services, which is interactive or kind of step oriented in nature, it may be a better choice to go with application development rather than the Power BI report. But if it's a single short input where we have a data flow or we have created some SSIS packages that are creating some data, that is where Power BI can accept the input from a data source, and it is ideally suited to process it within Power BI and then deliver the output to the end user. Um, if there is a need for a script or a program, ideally we should not have scripts or programs embedded within the report uh, unless the user knows it's safe to execute. It could open a can of worms with different needs for permissions, different tasks being performed by a script or a program versus what the report is designed to perform for the user. You could probably have a report which says Christmas greeting card, and I'm sure a lot of us are going to get emails this Christmas and New Year with, hey, click this to see what Bob has sent you, and that's not a link that any one of us wants to click. Uh, with regard to the output, we should also note that if the output has to be saved uh, between the different runs of the report, like for example, if a user comes in and runs a report for a recipe to make a burger, and they wanted to save the recipe and then give as input the next ingredients which they had, at that point, they require more interactivity versus what Power BI is delivering currently. It is still possible to have a certain amount of interactivity, and we will see some of that during a quick demo if possible. So when it comes to the demo that we are interested in, we are looking at working with interactive data input for reports. Built a quick site over here. The site is directly based off Power BI reports and the data that you see on the. I mean, it's not a web application and built in the traditional sense, but built using Power BI. Now, what this application does is it gets a list of products, components, and then asks the focus area that somebody may be interested in. For example, one can select SQL, reporting services, and then look for information about it. And how do you want to get information about particular aspect of reports? And you get a link. Now, this report is easy to create, but what if we have to get inputs from a user? So let's go ahead and see how this application gets its input. We use Excel forms, which allows for users to create a particular form with a set of, it's usually used for surveys and questionnaires, but we can tailor Excel forms in order to get data that we are interested in. Let's say we are interested in Microsoft SQL Server and analysis services and information with regard to, say, what's a cube. Just go in and MS SQL tips. We'll just take that tutorial shortcut and go in and give that as a reference for that particular report. If a user is logged in, this particular input is taken up directly with their emails and passwords. And if they're not logged in, this is stored as an anonymous user contribution. In either case, this shows a scenario as to how we can get user input for a particular report in conjunction with Excel forms. And whether the data is updated right away or later on, it depends on whether we are using one of the direct connections or whether we are using the periodic refresh which this report is currently using. And did you guess what the presentation was running on? The presentation was actually being run on Power BI as well. So once we have a report that we are interested, we have built it, there was a particular task that we wanted to achieve. The question arises as to what should be the way we deploy that report to our audience, whether on the internet or the intranet. The first option we discussed, there were simple reports which would give information about the weather, about a sports team scores. It could also be recipes if you want, and those kind of applications where data privacy security is not a problem. You can go ahead and use the publish to web option for any report. You would get URLs which can be embedded on an email, and also another URL which starts with iframe, which can be embedded onto a website by editing the HTML. Sizing of this particular web part is a tricky area, and let me show how that area can be addressed. So the report that you're seeing on the screen with regard to the initial report, now this was, there was another report that was created with regard to the past summit, showing how we can go ahead and identify the sessions that perhaps we want to attend over the course of the session. And now this report, I wanted that it should occupy as much part of the screen as possible. But initially, Power BI gave the option to simply show it over 800 by 600 points. Within the design of a simple HTML page, one can use a particular style sheet to calculate the padding from the bottom and the width and the height. And this particular style can be applied with regard to the iframe by showing it within a div. This ensures that the website is not only sizing the Power BI report correctly, but it is also responsive to a great extent. So as you can see, the Power BI report goes ahead and resizes based on the browser dimension, and that's what we wanted to achieve. When it comes to deploying Power BI on the intranet, this part of the seminar is not taking into account the Power BI reporting services, which is already available. We will use the Power BI service and talk about the Power BI apps, which are a way to group together and deliver the report, related reports and dashboards. The idea is that to achieve a particular set of activities, we are going to group together a certain number of reports and dashboards. If you are buying Christmas gifts for your friends and family, you could have a report of the deals which were available. You could have another report with the preferences of your friends, your family, anybody else that you're gifting. And you could also have another report which carries some of the prices from Amazon or prices from any of the other stores that you're interested in. Those could be grouped together into a Power BI app, and it could be deployed as an app which the end users can install. If you believe that the app is a must-have for end users, you could auto-install it, and whenever you make some changes in that app workspace and publish it, those changes are automatically reflected at the end users, report. This particular functionality or feature of Power BI apps is available when it comes to distributing these reports within an organization. Now, let's take the case of the developers who are working with traditional applications. They've invested a lot of time learning web development, web services, or Windows development, and they have built an app for a particular task. It could be a finance app, it could be apps for perhaps controlling turbines, apps which are meant for maybe the controlling the IoT feed which is coming in from a particular set of lights installed in the office for your Christmas tree. If there's a particular set of lights which blink or which go off, perhaps it could be the Grinch which would ruin the Christmas if not for any power outages. For those scenarios where applications have already been developed and we have to only provide some reports which are going to be embedded along with that, there are two choices. One choice is when we want to distribute them to users that do not have or do not intend to get a Power BI license or subscription at all. In those cases, the choice to make is embed for your customers. When we do that, the website acts as if a default user is already logged in and the report is shown in the context of that particular user. Row level security can still be implemented if we want to go ahead and enable different data as well as experiences on that particular report. If you are from a software vendor who is developing applications for multiple customers, that would be the mode of choice. It would entail having the Power BI embedded along with Azure, enabled for the sizing to be done, and you can also use the Azure credits towards that purpose. There's also the availability of Power BI embedded in a test scenario, which is at a very low cost versus having to purchase the license right away. The other option when it comes to users within the organization, usually the applications which are developed would be deployed on the corporate intranet. In such cases, if it's a large organization, they already have applications like SharePoint, Dynamics, and other products which are used for various scenarios. If the reports are interacting with such applications, if it is about the data which is generated via those applications, then the best choice is embed for your organization, where the Azure Active Directory tenant of the organization will act to authenticate the users, and the reports are shown against that. Now we have time for going over some of the scenarios that one would create a Power BI report rather than make a web application or even a mobile application. One of the scenarios is wherever you see a PDF file which has a table. Now I'm sure they have good intentions and want to share data with the end users, but when somebody gives out that data on a website, that is asking for many other people in the community to go ahead and develop a report and make it easy to scan through that data. The example shown here gives a list of colleges along with their departments and the type of courses they're offering. And we have made a Power BI report based off that, where the students can select a branch that they're interested in and get to see the options of where they would be able to study that particular course. Another scenario is the scenario where we show a conference schedule. Now, this was the conference which was organized by PAS. And if you look at the PAS schedule for that conference, this is how it has been given. There is a color-coded legend, if you will, for the different types of sessions. There's also information with regard to the time, the location, and then the session titles, the speakers, as well as the level for that particular session. When we take the data into Excel or try to use it as a direct source, one would see that there's a certain amount of processing that has to be done on that data. So let's consider the source data as it is, and then you would probably build a list of fields that are interesting for the application you have in mind. In this case, it's simply a conference schedule organizer. So we want to know what time, what place, and what exactly is going on over there. And when we say what event is going on, we would probably like to drill down further in terms of what is the product or what type of session it is, who are the speakers, and then make a choice. So that particular exercise can be done either directly through the query editor if you're comfortable with that. If not, Excel is a powerful product for going ahead and cleaning the data up. And when we look at the final Excel which is delivered to Power BI, it could simply have the data that we are interested in towards creating that report. So in the final report which is achieved, we can go ahead and filter on all those fields which we have included in that particular scenario. Now, all of us are working mostly with SQL servers, and hat tip nod to Brent, who's been doing some great work with performance and troubleshooting of SQL Server. There's a first responder kit for SQL, which is available. And that particular kit goes ahead and shows a lot of data on the SQL servers that are being managed and allow troubleshooting of performance as well as other problems which may be encountered, right from the query details to file speeds, file sizes, even some of the perfmon data. All that is available within a Power BI report in order to help SQL administrators get the best out of their SQL Server configuration. So these are some of the, perhaps the SQL example is a complex one, but especially creating schedules or creating reports based off some tables, these are simple scenarios that one can imagine when deciding whether to develop a report or whether to create an application. With that, I would like to hand over the presentation to Dan and Michael. There's also the set of links which I have found very useful with regard to learning and keeping in touch with the community of Power BI, and hoping that we all can achieve a lot in the year ahead and have a great year end as well. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Vijay. I appreciate it. It's great that you were able to present to our community. Thank you so much for taking the time. And let's take a look and see what kind of questions we have coming in here. One thing I was going to ask about, I guess I've always seen a scenario where maybe you use Power Apps or something to get information that you can then reference within the Power BI reports. You could only use that within your own organization, so I thought it was very clever how you used the Excel forms. Do you just want to maybe explain using the Excel form how that data then gets back into the Power BI report? Kind of show how that works.
Yeah, sure. Let me get to that part. So just to clarify the question, we had gone over the scenario where we had gone in and accessed the Excel form for a particular report. on expertsutra.com. That's the website. In case it's an experimental website which will continue to use only Power BI technologies. So the share your expertise points to a Excel form, and yeah, I think sometimes we get some errors thrown. so that was Excel form giving me the finger at that point. Let me go ahead and access that Excel form from the place where it is stored over here. It's on a OneDrive.
And stored in your OneDrive, okay.
Yes, exactly. And the OneDrive file for that one, if I can check when it was last modified, hopefully. So, last modified obviously won't cover the time when the data got refreshed over there. We would see the form, which came with regard to the information. I'm trying to trace out the right one over here. Not that one either. Now that's a good scenario to go into the Power BI and check what is your source of data. So let's see if we can trace down that report and the source of data over there. While you can go in and switch to Outlook with a click, you have to do 2 clicks to go to Power BI. When it comes to navigating your workspace, you can always go with either search or select those reports which are available. Just checking which report we are on so that we can go ahead and check the dashboard for that one.
And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to post those in the GoToWebinar, and we can get those answered here for you. So Vijay, how long have you been using Power BI now?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
How long have you been using Power BI?
Well, ever since it released.
Oh, okay. So, that's great.
So within Power BI, we can see the data that it's based off. You can also check within your sources as to which particular data source that it's based on. We see that it's the blog post one, which is the recent one, but that could be misleading. You can go into edit queries, and then within the queries, you can select the data that you're seeing and whether it's getting refreshed within that particular report. So you see that the test one is the one that we are looking for, and you can access that one. So the test1.xls over there. And this is what I was talking about in terms of whether the user is coming in anonymous or whether they had some information for the, if they logged in and they gave the input, it would have the email address of their organization, which is logged in over there. So once it gets into this particular Excel sheet, we can go ahead and refresh that report based on either an auto manual refresh, or even we could set it up on a refresh schedule. But the recommendation here is, since we want to make the application interactive, we could go ahead and use a database like SQL, or even if you are looking for a free one, perhaps PostgreSQL or MySQL variants, in order to have a link server to that particular data.
Sure. Have you ever
Is that
tried
a scenario?
Yep. No, yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried using the Power App integration yet?
The Power Apps integration, not with the data flow as such, but we want to go ahead and use that for a well-integrated scenario. So.
Okay. Yep. And I just saw recently that apparently they have made the Power App one from a custom visual to a native visual now, which is good to see. Someone is asking about a question. So like if you were going to create, try and generate invoices and other type of paginated reports, would you say using SSRS is a better tool for that, or would you try using Power BI for something like that?
So the paginated reports has recently been introduced as a feature which is available with Power BI as well. I think the user can go ahead and probably search for Power BI paginated reports, and you can see that on the screen. Another resource which I would point out is, if you go to Guy in a Cube, they have these awesome reports from Adam Saxton and others, which introduce how you can go ahead and use a particular feature. And I'm sure you'll find those fun as well as informative when you're working with Power BI.
Yeah, Patrick, wasabi sauce.
Yeah, those are really good ones.
Yeah, Guy in a Cube, yeah, those are great videos and tutorials.
Yeah, and when it comes to questions, there's also Twitter, where I'm not logged in right away, but you can go ahead and search for Power BI, and there'll be a lot of scenarios where you would be able to simply get a list of users and information which is within the same day you could get answers to most of your questions. There's a pretty active community for Power BI out on Twitter as well, apart from the Reddit that I mentioned in the resources at the end of the slides.
I definitely agree. Well, I know we're running up on our top of our hour now, but before we sign off, I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank Vijay for presenting to our community here. Vijay, before we sign off, is there anything, words of wisdom or next steps that you'd like to provide to the community before we sign off?
I think a lot of the coherence and context probably gets lost during presentations. So if I'm not clear, or if there is any context that is implied, do go ahead and clarify. If there is something that I've made a mistake, or it's something that sounded totally crazy, I apologize for any concern that I may have raised, and hope that we all can learn from each other and deliver a better end user experience. Thanks once again for the opportunity, and it's a great community to interact with.
Oh, it was very nice having you today. Thank you so much for presenting. Just a reminder, when you sign off, there will be a short survey to fill out, and we'll be using that to do a random generation for some Visa gift cards to hand out. And you'll get notified if you are a recipient of one of those gift cards. And we'll get this recording uploaded and posted on our YouTube channel, hopefully later today, or for sure tomorrow. Once again, thank you so much, Vijay, for presenting to our community, and have a good day, everyone.